Okay, so this video has already technically been made, but after sitting with it, I decided that I wasn't all that satisfied with my previous video that was entitled My Neurospicy Profile Part 1. I had originally intended to make a video that kind of explained my autism and then explained my ADHD. And I just don't feel like it flowed in a way that made me feel good, but it was the best that I had at the moment. And in an effort to try to be consistent with uploading videos, I think I rushed myself, and that's something I'm trying to unlearn. So, in the spirit of unmasking and learning how to work in my own flow, I've decided to allow myself to do a redo. And I'm glad I did that because in that time, I was able to sit with myself a little bit more and sit with my diagnosis and sit with my own personal realizations of what has been confirmed for me. And I feel like now I'm able to put it into words a little bit more clearly that is not only satisfying for me, but will hopefully be more understanding to you all who are watching. So, with that said, let's start this over. My name is Brittany Shanae, and I was recently diagnosed with autism and with ADHD just within the last few months. And it has been a really eye-opening experience. I have essentially been pulling myself apart through this new lens and feeling both a sense of great relief and massive amounts of confusion, especially since this process has guided me to really dive into this information about neurodivergence and what it means to be autistic. Now that we have new information and new understandings of what autism is, the controversy within all of that, and also the information out there about ADHD, and also how those things overlap with one another, and how sometimes it almost kind of seems like it's difficult to even know what is really at play, especially being diagnosed with both, and there's being so much crossover between the two in terms of the traits that show up. And then with autism being considered a neurological difference for some and a disorder for others. But no matter where you are on the spectrum, there are debilitating aspects to having that type of neurology in the society as it is currently set, where accommodations and understanding and information is so limited and minimally accepted in the collective. And then with ADHD, there being a conversation between that being, yes, an impact of neurology, but also perhaps maybe more so due to trauma than a genetic thing. But then also understanding that trauma itself has a genetic impact and implications on genetics as it continues to travel through bloodlines. And all of this information is very new in the grand scheme, and also not new in the ancient sense in terms of the spiritual understanding, and with spirituality and personal development being a special interest of mine. That is the best way that I'm able to understand this and try to make sense of this for myself. And so probably a lot of the ways that I explain my experience will always kind of fall back on that because, well, it gives me a great sense of relief. It makes the most sense for the way that my mind works. And I think there's also something empowering to look at it through that particular lens. So without further ado, I do want to get into the specifics of my experience of being AuDHD, or having both autism and ADHD, what those traits look like, maybe throw in a few examples of my experience, and yeah, let's just jump into it. So first of all, when I say autism, I'm speaking as a level 1 individual, or low support needs, or what would have used to been known as Asperger's syndrome, or high masking. So I have the ability, or even some may say the privilege from a social standpoint, to be able to walk through the world and present as neurotypical, right? So unless I say, hey, I am autistic, I have a unusual neurotype, just looking at me, it may not necessarily be obvious. But I have had many experiences where people have communicated with me and have shared with me enough to notice that my communication style, my thought processing style, and the way that certain experiences land for me, whether it's sensory or beyond, is very unique to me and not something that they at all experience. And after asking people enough, like, well, you know, those times when you feel like this, or when you think that, or this happens and you have this reaction, and I've literally had on many accounts people look at me and go, no. and I used to think that, okay, I guess I'm just different. You know, I've spent a lot of my life just feeling like I was different, and I thought that was just me. And I think that that is still true. Again, from coming from a human spiritual standpoint, I think my soul is in this body on purpose to have a particular type of human experience. And a part of that is this unique neurology that has me see the world through a very unique perspective, and to have certain responses to the world around me in a very particular and unique way. And then so my autistic nature is then paired with my ADHD. And my ADHD is labeled type 2, moderate, and attentive, according to the person who diagnosed me. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that when I was originally researching information about autism, there was a lot of it that was extremely familiar. But then there were some aspects of it that I felt like, well, this feels a bit too extreme for me to say that, like, this, you know, that just the autism is enough to explain this unique experience I'm having. And then when the ADHD portion was confirmed for me, it made a lot more sense. And I was coming upon content that was talking about both and how they have a lot of crossover, and how a lot of people who are autistic are also ADHD. And I want to say it was something like anywhere between 40 to 60%, a very significant number. And I'm not always great with retaining information, even information that's really interesting to me. And so, you know, I know that may be tough for some of you who are a little bit more like, give me the numbers, but numbers are not necessarily my thing. It's actually sort of a weak point for me in my type of processing. So forgive me. But it made a lot of sense to me when I started coming across information for AuDHD, and I was able to relate to that a lot more, because I have always felt like I've been in this sort of tug of war with myself, and how I really appreciate the stability and the comfort that routine brings, which is highly significant to the autism. And then, but I'm also somebody who, without a certain amount of change, it's very difficult for me to stay plugged in or to be present. And that, of course, speaks to the ADHD. On top of that, as neurodivergent people, we are more likely to experience trauma because of feeling so different in this society, in this world, that we're more likely to have CPTSD or PTSD. And for me, it's also been known for me for a really long time that I have had multiple trauma experiences starting in childhood throughout my life, that I feel like I've done a lot of therapeutic work and inner spiritual work to move through. But of course, the experience of those things still very much live in me, and things that I am always constantly working through. And because of that, I've also had a lot of physiological responses to the stress that that living in this experience brings when living in the dynamics of our society. And I didn't know why that was, and because of the culture I was brought up in and the family unit I was brought up in, I kind of got used to retreating or resorting to escapist behavior or dismissive behavior and just kind of push through, tough it out, rub some dirt on it, things got to get done, or you got to do what you got to do, whatever the case is. I didn't always know how to take care of myself. And so when I realized that there was a way to shift out of that into something that was more sustainable and worked for me, that opened my eyes to really turn to like self-care, health and wellness, psychology, all of these things to help me better understand myself, help me to better understand the environment that I grew up in, and eventually it has lent itself to support me in understanding myself and my neurology now that this has come up. In terms of learning disabilities, as I said before, I have struggled with math and numbers. The basic stuff I understand for the most part, but as it gets more complex, and you may say, oh, okay, well, not everybody has a math brain, and that's true, not everyone has a math brain. But there are some people who have brains that are very much wired for that, especially it's something you see pretty commonly with different autistic people who are just really great at seeing things logically and calculating things because of the pattern recognition. My pattern recognition, while I am able to apply it in the spiritual sense, like in terms of neurology, because there isn't necessarily like these outrageous equations and calculations that you have to do in order to come to some sort of answer that for me doesn't have any value as far as what interests me. But when it comes to spiritual stuff, I have found myself interested in numbers in that sense, and pattern recognition, like angel numbers and all that kind of stuff. And so I do find that fascinating. Birthdays, astrology, which in itself is also just kind of looking at patterns of things, but is looking more so at the quality of those things, not necessarily just at the numbers. When it gets into the numbers and all of that stuff, it just, you kind of lose me. But I'm very much interested in social emotional connections and the energy behind things and behavioral patterns in mindsets. That stuff really interests me. It's abstract, and it also has pattern within it. So there are calculable things, but not necessarily dealing with numbers. Also, there are certain social dynamics that I have found myself being pretty naive to. It has taken me longer to understand the social game that has to be played. Of course, though, as someone who is high masking, I think I innately know, and if you are a high masking autistic person or even a high masking ADHD person, perhaps you can attest to this, is that there is a certain level of social game playing that we're doing that we don't always know we're doing, because we are very self-conscious, knowing that we show up in an unusual way if we were to enter a situation naturally. And so in order for us to not put people off or to try to gain success and appease whatever audience or crowd we're in, or whoever it is that we have to deal with or interact with, that we will sort of police ourselves or alter ourselves to fit the situation so that we can, have as amicable or pleasurable of an interactive experience as we possibly can without ruffling any feathers, which I have been known to do, not intentionally. And on one hand, I enjoy kind of being a disruptor, because I know that for me, a lot of my personal growth has come from things disrupting me and me having to shift and adapt and grow. And I think that those situations, as challenging and difficult and even painful, physically, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally painful some of those situations were, I don't think that I would have some of the survival skills that I have as a neurodivergent person without being thrown in the deep end, if you will, that sort of forced me to swim. Otherwise, I would sink. And I do want to get into that more in other videos, looking at it from the astrological side and through different spiritual philosophies, because again, that's my personal special interest and something that I often turn to, that soothes me mentally and has helped really guide me before I even knew that I was neurodivergent or what neurodivergent was. Which also kind of brings me to back to this description of these different traits that I've had as a neurodivergent person, even before my diagnosis or before my realization, is that I identified as a highly sensitive person, and I had a video up about that too. But with my new information, it feels, I don't know, inappropriate almost to have that video up. I don't know, I could be overthinking it, which is something that I also tend to do. But as a highly sensitive person, I've always recognized that I had different sensory experience than other people. I distinctly recall as a child that the seams of my sock hurt my feet, that I could fall asleep anywhere and sleep through a lot of things, not realizing that I just had a low energy threshold and that I was constantly overwhelmed. But because I was young and because I had to learn how to adapt and I was in an environment doing things, that's all that I knew how to do, it just kind of became the laughing joke, and I just kind of carried on through life doing the best that I could. And, you know, I knew I was really picky about the things that I ate. My food couldn't touch. Different flavors and even very small changes would really stand out to me, as far as smells and space and all of this stuff. And I remember being told that, you know, my response to things was way too intense and extreme, and that I was overly sensitive and that I was being dramatic about all of this stuff. And I had developed phobias, I think, from that, you know, hypersensitive experience, especially when it came to like insects and things like that, because I could hear them, I could see them, I could feel them, and it was just so overwhelming, and to the point where I could not even visibly look at a picture of a bug. And because a lot of the teasing and the bullying that came from that, one of the things that, let me know if you as neurodivergent people have experienced this, but one of the things that you kind of notice when you are on other people's radar in terms of what your fears are, the things that make you uncomfortable, and you have big reactions to them, that there are people who will want to trigger you because they think it's fun or funny, not realizing that for you, you are actually really highly distressed. And so for me, I would do two things. I had a lot of different responses. So some people are like, you either fight or flight or fawn or whatever. I think that we all do all of them personally, but we may have our defaults. When I was really young, I was definitely a fighter, but because oftentimes I was responded back to aggressively, or sometimes my fighting would lead to worse situations that would cause me to have to deal with more of the nervous response that my body was having, that I learned how to shut down. You know, you can't let people see you sweat, you can't let them see you react big, because then they'll do things to try to get even more of a rise out of you, and then at that point there's no turning back, right? And you have no self-control. And if there's anything I'm not a fan of, is not having self-control, having that sensation of being totally out of control of how my body is responding, and my intellect has no room at all to be in play. That makes me feel really unsafe and really uncomfortable. I give myself grace for the times where I have shown up that way, and I can definitely think of stories where I feel like, man, I wish I had shown up better. But I also learn from those situations to go, okay, if I continue to respond this way, this will get worse. I don't want that. And so in order to protect myself, I would rather shut down. But of course, shutdowns have their own implications and negatives, cons, and that continues spiraling in the other direction, where you don't feel much of anything, and you become hyposensitive as a way to self-protect. And that can get really challenging when it comes to the self-care aspect of living life. If you're not in touch with what you feel and what you think, then that still kind of gives the world room to take advantage of you, right? Or for you to put yourself in situations that are not necessarily great, because when you're in a depressed mode, you still don't have enough self-control in order for you to live life the way you would prefer to live it. So I have experienced those ups and downs enough, and I still do, but I've experienced it enough to really learn from them, to see the pattern within that, so that I can change things. And that is the way that I approach my self-care, and that is probably the way in which my mind processes and calculates things and takes pattern recognition and tries to use it as a personal benefit or for the benefit of those around me. So speaking to those sensory sensitivities, heightened smells can make me sick. Bright lights can give me migraines, and things that, say, my husband, where for him it's like, perfectly fine. For me, they can be overwhelming. All the same, there are some times where I feel hypostimulating, or I feel like I need more stimulation rather. And that might be too much for the people around me. And so because of where the autism is, with the low threshold, and the ADHD, which has a high threshold of stimulation, for me, there's this sweet spot in the middle that I feel the most balanced and satisfied and constructive and productive and clear. And it can take a lot to get in there, and it can take a lot to keep it from being too much. So imagine the dance that, those of us who are AuDHD have to do in order to keep ourselves in the space we need to be, in order to be the best that we can be, show up the best that we can for ourselves and for everyone around us. In order to do that, alone time is imperative, just so that I can have time to be in my own space without worrying about being perceived and worrying about having to perceive what other people are doing. Because having other people in my space, or too many things going on in my space, I'm not always able to block it out. And that can get really challenging. Of course, we live in a day and age where there is so much coming at us all the time, from our phones, I live in an apartment, so just by looking outside of my window, what my neighbors got going on, I'm sure they're able to see on this side. And so just knowing that there are always eyes around, whether it's the security cameras or, just stepping outside and going to the grocery store, it can be a lot, because there's so much to process, and that people are also processing you. And then for me particularly, because I kind of have an eccentric look, I have a tendency to draw attention that can make me really uncomfortable on days where I would rather not be perceived. But I've also had to learn, and I think that that's also a part of the reason why my soul is here in this body, is how to learn how to be okay with being perceived, with being seen. And that's a difficult thing to do as someone who has moments where I would much rather be invisible. And then there are other times where I know that I can be really larger than life, and I don't mind being seen, and I'm talkative, and I'm the life of the party, and all of that, when I am in the proper stimulated sweet spot. And then, when I feel balanced and I feel like I have the energy to interact with people, and I'm not overthinking, and my anxiety isn't high, and all of that. On a general basis, I do tend to feel a lot of anxiety because of as I'm reframing my personal life story for myself in a more empowering and self-loving way. The things that I saw as social failures really had a huge impact on me, whether it was the loss of friendships, toxic loverships, tense dynamics with family members, or even communication difficulties within my marriage, or just me being in my own mind and feeling again like I'm in this me versus me situation. That can be a lot and difficult to handle, on top of just life stuff, paying the bills, going to work, trying to nurture the relationships that are going well, all of that stuff. Learning, growing as a person. I'm 35, right? So I was considered late diagnosed. And so looking back over my life with this new understanding, it's like, oh man, I'm looking at how things could have been different if I had known this sooner, right? And I feel like I've been playing the game on hard mode this whole time, and that wasn't necessarily necessary. Again, I'm embracing that my story is my story, and I found out what I needed to find out because it is what it is. I can't change that. And so I want to use this experience to do something constructive. But I also recognize that not having the awareness has made it feel a lot more difficult. And now that I know, it doesn't necessarily, at least not yet, it doesn't necessarily feel like, oh, okay, everything's easy now. But it definitely makes things make more sense. And I know that it does bring a sense of ease just to have things make more sense. So I think I went a little bit on a tangent here, but you all get the point. One of the consequences of not being in that narrow sweet spot is that I can become so overstimulated or overwhelmed by everything that I have going on inside of me and around me that I can send myself into overdrive and exhaust myself, and it can be very, very challenging to recover. And I can also make myself sick. I can also make myself physiological sick if I extend myself beyond a healthy capacity. And then if I'm understimulated, it can be very difficult to focus. When I'm in the zone and I'm interested in what I'm doing and I have the energy and all of that, I can hyperfixate on things and I can get things done quicker than anybody. And that actually makes me a really great employee. And so when it comes to the actual work side to work, I feel like I kill it most of the time. And I'm usually going above and beyond and doing things that even I didn't even know I could do, right? But when it comes to the social side, it's something else. And I feel like it's the social stuff because it has been more challenging. I think that my stimulation sweet spot, especially over time, has narrowed even further than what it used to be. So those times where I'm the life of the party has really diminished quite a lot. What that looks like is different. Also, I'm older. I'm 35 now, not 25. So I don't necessarily feel like I need to be the life of anybody's party, but the one inside myself, right? Or in my marriage. Hey, yo. But anyway, I'm learning that I'm a very particular person. And I'm also realizing that I've always been a very selective person. And I think that speaks a lot to the autistic side as well. But I think those things also sort of meet in the middle about being very selective and understanding like what it is that makes me feel good. And if it doesn't make me feel good, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a meal, whether it's an activity, whether it's a self-care routine or whatever, if it needs to change, if something needs to go, if something needs to come, then fine. But at the same time, I want to remain open to things, but I also want to allow myself to be selective and to know when, okay, this is not working for me. I don't need to keep trying it on over and over and over again. I recognize that this doesn't work. And so time to go on to the next. And I feel like that's where the ADHD sort of balance out the autism in that sense. In terms of my thinking, there are times where I can be very black and white, where it's just like, well, if this is what you're going to say, then this is what this means. It is what it is. And especially if I feel some type of way emotionally about it, I can get very vigilant. And I think that can also play into the trauma response as well. When, you feel sort of betrayed or slighted or constantly feeling misunderstood, which for me, communication and getting on equal ground is something that I feel like is my heart's desire when it comes to connection. If I can get on equal ground with you and we can see eye to eye, even if we don't necessarily think the same way, but if we can find that middle ground between us that connects us and really makes us feel like, yo, I ride for you, you ride for me, or I really, 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 really enjoy it when we're in each other's company, and whatever beauty can come from that. When that is damaged or cracked in some way, I feel that very, 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 very deeply. And then I become a bit hyper vigilant, and then I become very black and white, and then the wiggle room, the leniency, and all of that I may have had before narrows. So I feel like for me, it's I can be even selective in that. However, I can also have these really big abstract ideas that are not so black and white, where there is a lot of gray. And I think for me, because again, my special interest being spirituality and spiritual philosophy and things having to do with the unseen elements, that allows me to practice a certain sense of openness. So, when I start to get a little too rigid, sometimes I'm able to balance myself out based off of, depending, I guess, on how my brain is tugging at me, so to speak. And I think, again, that goes back to stimulation. Like, how am I stimulated? How am I engaging with this thing, with this person? What is my relationship? Also, what are my beliefs as it relates to this particular topic, or even about a person or an activity or whatever? And a lot of that sets the tone too. So I've noticed that how I'm able to work on myself or balance things out when I feel like I'm kind of tugged between like how to be. Stillness. Practicing stillness and mindfulness is extremely important. And sometimes not acting is the best action we can take until we can get balanced and clear. But if we are not afforded that luxury in any given moment, then at the very least, allowing myself to let both sides sort of work together at the same time helps a lot. And recognize that it may not be the way that other people do it, allowing myself to be unorthodox, and just do it, right? And just, instead of trying to do it in a way that I know is not going to work for me, it's not going to yield the same results as if a person who is skilled in that area or knows how to play that game, it works for them. Instead, just learning how to be like, hey, the way that I do it, it's going to look real crazy to you. And you're going to have to be okay with that in order for you to really, really get the best out of me. And that goes in, again, relationships, work relationships, and even just relating to myself and recognizing that as I grow, as I age, as I mature, the way that I used to do things won't necessarily look the same, and allowing myself the freedom to express all of the different flavors of Brittany. One of the things that I do as a neurodivergent person is I ruminate a lot. I have a crazy amount of self-awareness. Now, this doesn't mean that I don't have blind spots, right? I always have areas where I can realize more about myself and grow. But I am very hyper aware. Just like I was saying, how when we put on a mask and we're playing a social game, even when we don't realize it, is that, sometimes it's like, oh man, in that conversation I said this thing, why did I say that? I could have just said that better, or maybe this person was waiting for me to do this, or did I misinterpret what they said when they did this, or, and because it doesn't come natural for me, and because the way I would normally naturally show up isn't necessarily socially acceptable in terms of, sometimes I can just come off in a way where my body language just reads that I don't care, or because I may not engage in full eye contact with a person continuously, that it may seem like I'm not listening, or if, I'm just not in the mood to meet a new person, but I have to meet a new person, then I may come off as like, I don't know, an asshole or something. And I hate that, because I know that in the past where I really cling to my people-pleasing tendencies, again, a trauma response, I would try to do what I can to try to make up for it, or, put on this show of like, hey, I'm gonna be a different person so that you can see the life of the party side of me. But that can be really challenging and energetically draining, mentally draining, to try to keep up when I'm not really feeling it. And so, again, just learning how to grant myself the space to have those moments alone where I can think and let it out. And some of the ways that I allow myself to work through that is by writing, by verbal processing, or by being physically active in some way, whether it's dancing or hitting the gym. I like to lift weights sometimes. I kind of go in and out of doing it, and it's because I get so burnt out of the gym so quickly. I like going to the gym, but the way that other people go ham in the gym, I've tried to do that, and maybe I'm still figuring out what works for me, but I've just noticed that going every day is not something that I'm able to sustainably do. So instead of every day, I try to go 3 days a week. At some time, especially with work and all of the things with the nature of my job, which is extremely social, and there's a whole lot of sensory input, I just don't have the capacity to do it all the time. But I'll do small things like just come home and do 10 push-ups, or while I'm at work, if I'm having a bathroom break, I get the big stall, I'll do 10 squats while I'm in there. Something that just keeps me active, keeps me moving. And, I'm able to, I think it's also a way of stimming, which, you know, that brings me to stimming or processing. I think stimming is a physical way in which we process energy or information. And for me, I'm a verbal processor, so I really, really, really need to work out my thoughts. I need to speak it out and release it. Sometimes I'll sing, you know, if I don't have the words, I'll just sing or hum. I also am a writer. I really just I love journaling. I've been journaling since I was a child. When I felt like I couldn't communicate or like get through to my mom or something like that, I would write letters to her, or I would just journal like crazy. I've been keeping a journal since elementary school, and I've been fairly consistent with it because it's just a fantastic outlet to try to work out my thoughts, even if it's not coherent for real, or you know, it doesn't make sense and it's not grammatically correct, which I used to kind of stress over, but then I started releasing that, and I think that's a beautiful thing that the writing process offers. Also, I do have other little ways that I stim when I'm in situations that are not so obvious to people around me, maybe. And this is something I really only started noticing after I was diagnosed, where they're just like, do you stim? And I was like, I don't think I stim, not really. I mean, sometimes I do feel like I have this energy inside of me, but I would just do the conventional, I just go to the gym, or I'll just, you know, have some special time with my husband, or whatever it is, right? Where it's just like, okay, I'll just be physically active in some way to work it out. That just means that I needed to, you know, have some sort of physical movement and I'll be fine. And there are some times where that doesn't feel like enough, or it's like it feels like whatever the energy is inside of me is just so overwhelming that it's just nonstop. And if I'm in the middle of a meeting and I need stimulation, then obviously those other options are inaccessible. So what I found is, like, you know, I'm a leg shaker, or I will sing what I'm doing out loud so that my stream of thought will continue to flow and connect instead of like disappear into the mental ether. Or I'll tap my fingers. Or one thing that I'll do a lot, which I can do anywhere, is just press my nail into my index finger. I'll press my thumbnail into my index finger and I'll kind of walk around and I'll do that. And I notice that, like, oh man, I actually do that a lot, to the point where I like get these lines in my fingers. But again, that is an example of the self-awareness, something I didn't even realize that I was doing because I didn't have the language for it. And now that I have the language for it, I'm much more aware of what it is that I'm doing when I'm moving my body. Also, looking back at my childhood, I realized that I was a nail biter, like a really bad nail biter. I did have a friend who was actually much worse than me. She would get it to the point where it was like barely even a nub or a nail. And for me, it would get to a certain point where it would hurt. And so that was usually what would stop me. And I remember that it was almost like an addictive thing. I didn't realize that as a child, looking back on it, that I was really experiencing anxiety. And that was one way that I was dealing with it, was biting my nails. But I wanted to have pretty nails like some of the other girls did. And so my mom was like, if you stop biting your nails, we'll get your nails done. And so I had to really train myself. What I didn't realize, though, is I had found other ways to self-soothe that weren't necessarily so healthy. You know, food is a comfort thing for me, and so I have struggled on and off with overeating, you know, eating my emotions or eating my anxiety to try to self-soothe, right? But because my health is important to me, and I have a personal goal to age well, to age as a healthy person, and to sort of break the unhealthy pattern of dying a slow, painful, uncomfortable death, like so many of the loved ones that I've seen go before me, I knew that I was going to have to make some changes. So, you know, I shifted into other habits, and some of those habits have been good, and some of those habits have not been so beneficial, or used to the extreme. They have become unbeneficial. And I suspect that is a video that I will make in the future as well, just about like neurodivergence, the anxiety that builds from that experience, and things that may actually be your body's way of seeking stimulatory experiences, but end up becoming addictive behaviors. And I think that's a really important thing for us to address, because in the research that I've come across so far, neurodivergent people, we do have an increased chance of developing unhealthy addictions because of our neurology and not having healthy ways to cope, or not being accommodated. So also in terms of processing, I am a question asker. I realized though over time, I've learned the hard way that not a lot of people appreciate that. So I have learned a little bit of that social game of learning how to pull back on questions and noticing when people are feeling uncomfortable. But I feel the most enthusiastic about a connection when I'm able to just ask questions and the person knows that in no way am I trying to like just be in their shit or trying to get any tea on them or anything like that. And I noticed that that's a concern that people have, and I get it because that has happened to me, right? Because I have in the past been maybe what some may call an oversharer, and and I know how some people may feel uncomfortable with that because not everybody wants to be all up in your tea, right? And so things I've learned the hard way, you know, how much to communicate, how much to pull back, knowing when a quirky, kooky conversation is turning or crossing over a boundary that may be triggering to somebody. And also understanding that like there are people out there who do just want to trigger you just to mess with you, and me learning how to pull myself back from those situations instead of being like, well, why are you this way? And you know, like, well, how come you're doing this? Or what about you in your situation? You know, because then I realized that now people will suck you into that energy and trap you there. Next thing you know, you're drained and your energy is sucked dry, and you anytime you're around this person, I think that there are a lot of energy vampires around, and some people I think know that they're that way and other people are unaware, right? And I think even we can be energy vampires unknowingly just because we ask so much, because a lot of us are bottom up thinkers where we need all of these details so that we can understand the details, and then we construct the idea from there, and then we're able to see the bigger picture, where neurotypical people need the bigger picture and then they can figure out the details afterwards. But for me, the bigger picture, if there's some holes in it for me that don't make sense, then it never really looks like a bigger picture no matter how much you present it to me. I need the little details first, but I also need the details that are that make sense to my thought processing style. So while me and another neurodivergent person may both really need the details for our bottom up thinking, the type of details they need, say if you're a math whiz, right, you're looking at the numerical side of things, the calculable side of things, and I'm looking at the social emotional details of things, or like what is the purpose, what is the outcome of this thing in terms of the ripple effect we want to have in society. I tend to look at stuff like that, and all of those things are important. It's just that my mind may not be able to calculate the way that another person does, and vice versa. So I keep that in mind, and realize that not everyone is ready to hear my questions, and everyone may not be able to take my questions for what they are, which is just, I really just want to understand something. I have to pick it apart in my mind for it to make sense for me. Kind of like how there are people out there, like even kids, who will take apart radios and bikes and other mechanics and put it back together or reconfigure it or whatever. And those people are natural born engineers. And I think that that's so dope that there are people who can do that in terms of like actual material things. When it comes to technology, that is not my strong suit, okay? It takes me a long time to learn technology. But again, when it comes to the impacts on behavior and personalities and how experiences shape us and all of that stuff, that's the stuff that really gets my gears going. So yeah, I digress. So when it comes to not being accommodated very well, and being in high stress situations, those traditional meltdowns and shutdowns that you may hear other autistic people talk about, and I think other ADHD people are actually talking about their experiences with this as well, where I am just not able to self-regulate. I am already an emotionally responsive person, being a highly sensitive, wired person in which things can really trigger me emotionally. I'm one of those people who I will cry at a movie. I will laugh incessantly at a joke. I will go on overanalyzing angry tirades, right? And I know for me, it feels good for me to get it out, right? It feels authentic for me to just allow myself to have those outbursts of an experience. But I know for other people that can be really overwhelming. And so meltdowns can be scary for me and other people, which is why alone time is so imperative, because when I have meltdowns, as I'm learning not to judge myself, I realize it's important to have that if I'm overstimulated, I have to sort of like release the cap off the bottle, so to speak. For the shutdowns, again, I think that that's imperative for us to recover. If something again is overstimulating us or puts us off or makes us feel unsafe, I think retreating is not necessarily the worst thing to do. I just think that they both can become problematic when meltdowns turn into angry, violent outbursts, which has happened for me, I'll be honest. Thankfully, I don't think I've ever like permanently injured anybody, but I have definitely handled situations not in the best way because of the overwhelming sensations that I feel when I feel emotionally reactive, which I'm so grateful for the information, and I forgot who said it, but there was a philosopher or somebody who said something along the lines of, when something happens and our reaction to it happens, there's this space in between, and it's really about learning how to take advantage of that space, which when you're younger and when you haven't learned how to self-regulate, or when you haven't gained a certain amount of insight, there doesn't really seem like there's any space between when something happens and when you react to it if it's triggering. So what I've really learned is how to become more mindful of that space, and that is something that has saved me from melting down in situations where doing that could have made things a whole lot worse. Okay, so that's just how I handle it for myself. It's not that those sensations go away, it's just that I handle it differently. I'm able to usually postpone a meltdown until I'm able to get alone, and then I'm able to deal with myself accordingly. So it's not something you cure or learn how to not do anymore. It just expresses itself differently instead of waiting first for things to get too crazy. But if you're in a situation where you don't have that luxury, sometimes it's best to just walk away, or to realize, like, if I do anything else to interact in the situation, things are going to boil over. So let me do what I need to do to remove myself from the situation, however that looks for you. And for shutdowns, just making sure that we don't over isolate. I know that I've done that before, where I've shut myself off from people so bad, and I'm actually learning how to come out of that. Like, I'm not crazy about inviting any new people into my life right now. Although and that's for a safety measure, but I also know that it's important for us to continue to reintegrate back into the world with our new knowledge, to not allow difficult situations that make us feel unsafe and scared to keep us from living our lives and forming connections that, could continue to have a positive impact on us down the line. And also for us to be able to not close ourselves off from certain opportunities that may interest us. So that is not an exhaustive list of everything. I can honestly go on a whole lot more, but I've decided I'm gonna stop there. That's all that I have. I want to thank everyone who commented on the previous video, the coming out autistic video. I am so grateful for the messages that you all left in the comments, and just know, by you all sharing what you shared, you never know who's going to see it. You never know who else it may touch or impact. So just know that doing that, you are also contributing to this healing process for the collective. And it's an honor for me to be able to share my story with you all. And I'm just so glad that it's benefiting somebody out there. So if you've made it this far, thank you. I appreciate it. If you did see the first video before I took it down, feel free to comment if you felt like this was more clear or not. I don't know. I'm still learning how to communicate. Communication is something that has been an ebb and flow, trial and error sort of thing for me. So especially in this type of way, I've been wanting to do this channel for a long time, just had a hard time really landing on what it is that I wanted to do and talk about. And again, just kind of speaking to the way our spiritual human experiences flow. Sometimes things just happen in ways that you just could have in no way predicted. And so here I am. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.